The story begins in stillness. You are standing on a vast, open plain somewhere between the Senegal and Niger rivers, a land baked gently by the sun and brushed by the dry breath of the Sahara. It is the 9th century, though time here does not rush forward in neat years. It stretches, as if drowsy, beneath the slow turning of caravans and the hum of cicadas. This is the Empire of Ghana, not the modern nation that carries its name, but a much older realm, one that existed where today's Mauritania and Mali touch. Its people called it Ouagadougou, the land of herds and gold. Its fame reached far away, whispered in the markets of North Africa and across the Mediterranean, where merchants repeated the words, the land of gold, as if it were a spell. The empire was built, not on armies, but on patience. There were no roaring battles that carved its boundaries, no great marble monuments that told its story. Instead, it was shaped by dust, golden dust, and by the quiet trust between traders who met under the wide African sky. A landscape of waiting. The geography of Ghana was a landscape of waiting. For months, caravans from the north drifted slowly toward the capital city, Kombe-Sela. They came bearing salt, cloth, metal, and glass beads, treasures from lands where the air was cool and sea breezes brushed over stone cities. From the south, others came on foot, bringing ivory, kola nuts, and, most importantly, gold. The fine dust panned from the rivers and sifted from the soil of the forest lands. When these travelers finally met in the middle, they did not speak each other's tongues, but they shared a single language, trade, built on ritual and silence. It is said that the Sinink people of Ghana practiced a form of silent barter. A northern merchant would arrive at a market, spread out his salt or cloth, and step back. Then a local trader would approach, examine the goods, and leave a small pile of gold dust beside them. Both would withdraw, waiting. If the salt trader found the gold acceptable, he would take it and go. If not, he would step back again, silently, until a better offer appeared. There were no shouted prices, no coins clinking, only the whisper of wind over the sand and the faint shimmer of dust in the air. The market city of Kombe-Sela, the center of this quiet empire, stood. Kombe-Sela, a twin city, one part royal, one part merchant. Archaeologists describe it as a maze of clay houses and narrow streets, where traders from across Africa gathered in the shade of woven canopies. Some carried fine scales made from bone and brass, used to measure the weight of gold dust with precise care. Others kept tiny leather pouches tied to their belts, filled not with coins, but with powdery wealth, gold so fine it could drift away on a breath. Imagine the morning there, before sunrise. Smoke rises from clay ovens. Goats wander lazily between courtyards. The air smells faintly of millet porridge and wood ash. As the first heat rolls in, the market begins to stir, the slow rustle of baskets opening, the dull clack of pots set on the ground, the soft scrape of a trader's knife cutting through dried meat. There is no hurry. Trade here does not chase time. It flows with it. The king of Ghana, known simply as the Ghana, meaning war chief, ruled from a walled palace not far from the market. His court was said to be rich in gold and guarded by soldiers in embroidered tunics, their spears tipped with iron. Yet even this splendor was quiet. The king's wealth did not roar in conquest. It glimmered softly through tribute and trade, a silent currency. To understand the soul of Ghana, you must understand gold dust. It was not merely money, it was ritual. Every speck carried meaning. Weighed carefully in the calm of morning trade, the people of Ghana believed that raw gold nuggets belonged to the king alone. To possess one without permission was treason. Only gold dust could circulate among the people. This system kept greed in check, and it turned the act of trade into something sacred, a matter of trust, balance, and restraint. Merchants carried their gold in tiny gourds or leather pouches. When they traded, they measured it with delicate scales that could be thrown off by the wind. Some dipped their fingers in the dust to test its quality. Others stored it in the seams of their robes, so light that they could forget they were carrying wealth at all. There were no banks, no ledgers, no official coins, only memory and custom. The marketplace was a living account book where each deal was sealed, not by signature, but by reputation. A man's honesty was his currency. His silence was his security. The rhythm of everyday life beyond the market. Life in Ghana unfolded in patterns of quiet persistence. Villages clustered around wells, their mud walls glowing orange in the sunset. Farmers worked the dry fields with patient rhythm, coaxing millet and sorghum from the stubborn soil. Children played beside the wells, their laughter mixing with the low bleating of goats. At night, fires flickered through the darkness like stars fallen to earth, and the sound of drums carried softly across the plains, not for war, but for stories. Travelers who visited from the north described a kingdom both humble and rich. The Spanish Cherub writer, Al-Bakri, who never saw Ghana himself, but gathered tales from traders in the 11th century, wrote that the king's city was surrounded by wells with buildings of stone and wood, and that the people dressed in fine linen and cotton dyed in deep colors. He described golden bracelets, iron ornaments, and markets so orderly they seemed to hum with quiet discipline. But between those lines, you can sense something else, the peaceful monotony that made such order possible. Ghana's greatness rested not on spectacle, but on routine. It was an empire of habits, weighing, measuring, storing, walking, waiting, salt and gold. The twin breaths of empire. The empire lived on the exchange between two opposites, salt and gold. In the north, the Sahara offered nothing but heat and salt, the white slabs mined from places like Taghaza. In the south, forests hid rivers that shimmered with gold dust. The merchants who linked these worlds became the arteries of an empire, pumping silent wealth across thousands of miles. Salt was life. It preserved food, kept bodies from failing in the heat, and seasoned the otherwise bland porridge that sustained most people. Gold was power, a material that traveled far beyond Ghana's borders, decorating palaces in Morocco and mosques in Andalusia. The journey between salt and gold took weeks, sometimes months. Caravans moved at night to escape the heat, following stars and memory. Each stop was planned, a well here, a grove there, and at each resting point the rhythm of trade paused, not ended, only waited. In those pauses, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the empire, slow, steady, deliberate. The king and his court. The Ghanaian king ruled with quiet dignity. His palace was said to be surrounded by domed huts and guarded by dogs adorned with gold collars. When he appeared in public, drums sounded not as an alarm, but as an announcement that something sacred was about to move through the air, he sat under a canopy. Surrounded by his court and musicians, the air filled with the scent of incense. Petitioners approached, bowing low, and placed dust or gifts before him. Justice, tribute, and trade all flowed through his hands, measured with the same patience as gold dust, though called King of Gold. The Ghana did not hoard his wealth in glittering halls. It spread through his people like sunlight, building stability more than splendor. Roads were kept open, markets secure, caravans protected, in a region where survival depended on trade. This stability was wealth itself. Whispers across the desert from North Africa. Camel caravans carried word of Ghana's riches. Muslim merchants, travelers, and scholars, Arabs, Tuaregs, spoke of a land where gold seemed endless and peace almost effortless. They brought with them not only goods but ideas, new ways of writing, measuring, and praying. Yet, in these early centuries, the Ghana Empire remained distinct. Islam was known but not yet dominant. Traditional beliefs held the rhythms of daily life. The people honored the spirits of earth and ancestors. They built their faith not from books, but from seasons, the promise of rain, the return of caravans, the steady hum of markets. To outsiders, it may have seemed primitive. To those who lived within it, it was balance, a slow harmony between body and land, trade and trust, time and patience. A quiet greatness. Empires often announced themselves with monuments. Ghana announced itself with consistency. There were no pyramids or temples here. No grand inscriptions to carve its story into stone. Its legacy was made of routines, the gentle sound of pestles grinding grain, the laughter of traders as they waited for dust to settle, the creak of camels rising at dawn. Yet this quiet greatness drew attention. The more the world heard of Ghana's gold, the more its silence seemed mysterious. To those beyond the desert, it was a golden dream shimmering in the heat, a land where wealth was measured in handfuls of dust. But every silence hides a question. How long can a kingdom built on trust and gold dust endure, when whispers of wealth drift farther than the caravans that carry them? The sun rises slowly over the Sahel, pale at first, then swelling into a fierce white eye above the horizon. The air shivers with heat before the day has even begun. From the northern edge of Ghana's realm, you can already see them, small shapes on the horizon, shimmering like ghosts against the sand. Camels, dozens of them, walking in deliberate rhythm, their long necks swaying with the calm certainty of creatures that know the desert better than humans ever could. These are the caravans, the veins and arteries of West Africa's trade. Their steps connect to worlds, the green fields of the south and the pale salt lands of the north. Each journey is a slow negotiation between exhaustion and survival. For the merchants who lead them, the sound of hooves on sand is as regular and necessary as a heartbeat. The salt, road salt, begins its story in the mines of Taghaza and all far to the north, deep inside the Sahara. There, men live in towns built entirely of salt blocks, walls, mosques, beds, even roofs. The desert wind never rests, and so they cover their faces with cloth to keep the salt dust from cutting their skin. Each day, they descend into rectangular pits and hack at the white ground with iron tools, pulling up rough slabs that glimmer faintly in the sunlight. The work is silent. The heat steals speech. They stack the slabs like bricks, load them onto waiting camels, and tie them down with leather ropes. One by one, the animals rise to their feet, and the caravan begins to move south, a procession of pale burdens against the golden desert. Each slab of salt is heavy, but it is worth its weight in gold, quite literally. Without it, no food can be preserved, no trade routes can survive. It is the invisible skeleton holding the empire together. To the merchants, every journey is an act of faith. Between Taghaza and Ghana lie weeks of emptiness, dunes, mirages, and the occasional well dug deep into rock. They travel mostly by night, guided by the stars. By day, they rest in the shade of their own tents. The camels folded like tired shadows around them. A single mistake, a missed well, a misjudged wind could erase a caravan from the desert as easily as a footprint in sand. Yet the roots endure. Each generation learns them by heart, memorizing every oasis, every ridge, every stretch of wind-carved silence. Meeting at the edge of empires, when the salt caravans finally approach Ghana's borders, the rhythm of travel shifts. Scouts appear on the horizon, sometimes mounted on horses, sometimes on foot, watching from a distance. No one simply walks into Ghana. Every merchant must be measured and recorded, their goods declared, their tribute paid. Near the border towns, the desert gives way to scrubland thorn trees, tufts of dry grass, the smell of dust and life mixed together. The air grows thick, and the merchants know they are nearing Kaumbi-Sklath, the city of gold. Here they are met by Ghanaian officials, men dressed in bright cloth, their faces calm but unreadable. They inspect the salt, count the camels, and collect a tax, one for entering, another for leaving. These taxes are not resented. They are part of the invisible structure that keeps trade safe. For every merchant knows that within Ghana's borders, no caravan will be raided, no goods stolen, and no man cheated. The silence of the market is protected by law. It is said that the Ghanaian king employed thousands of soldiers, though most rarely saw battle. Their presence was a promise that the peace of trade would not be broken by greed or blood. A dance of trust trade in Ghana was more ceremony than commerce. The silent barter that puzzled Arab travelers still continued here, though perhaps less strictly than before. A merchant from the north might spread his salt, his copper, or his cloth upon a mat and retreat. The local traders, often from the Wangara or Soninke peoples, would approach, inspect the goods, and sprinkle gold dust beside them. Neither side spoke. Instead, they listened to the wind, to the rustle of camels, to the quiet certainty of value. Once an agreement was reached, it was sealed not with ink or contract, but with gesture, a nod, a small movement of the hand, or the simple act of stepping away in satisfaction. The economy of Ghana was not built on abundance, but on trust. Every trader knew that greed disrupted balance. Every dishonest act would echo through the markets for years. Reputation was a form of wealth, and silence was its language. The northern visitors, by the 10th century, visitors from far beyond the desert began to take notice. Muslim merchants from Sijilmasa, Mecca, and Ifriqiya crossed the Sahara to trade not only salt, but also textiles, metalware, and horses. They brought with them written records, weights, measures, and the call to prayer that echoed softly across the dunes at dawn. For many of these visitors, Ghana was a wonder. Al-Bekri, the Andalusian geographer, recorded their tales in his book of Routes and Realms. He described how the king sat in state, surrounded by interpreters, drummers, and nobles, wearing gold ornaments so bright that the eye could not linger on them. He noted the twin cities, one Muslim, one traditional, coexisting peacefully side by side. Kaumbi Salem, he said, was half a place of trade, half a palace of spirits. Imagine the contrast. On one side, the call to prayer rings out, and merchants kneel on woven mats facing the north. On the other, priests pour libations at shrines to the spirits of earth and ancestors. Between them, the market flows calm, constant, eternal. Gold's long journey from Ghana's markets. The gold began its long pilgrimage north, packed into leather pouches and loaded again onto camels. It traveled to Sigilamasa, where it was exchanged for silver coins. From there, it crossed to the Mediterranean, finding its way into the hands of Venetian bankers, Andalusian jewelers, and Cairo merchants. By the time it glittered in the crown of a European king, its origins had been forgotten. Only the dust remembered the rivers of Ouagadougou, this quiet flow of gold-shaped continents. It built mosques, palaces, and libraries far away, and it allowed Ghana to thrive in peace. Yet every flow has a cost. The more the world desired Ghana's gold, the heavier the caravans became, and the more the silence of the desert began to stir with outside voices. The slow creep of change rarely arrives with thunder. In Ghana, it arrived with footsteps, patient, unhurried, inevitable. Islam began to spread, carried not by conquerors, but by clerics and merchants who prayed in the shade of their tents. They built small mosques near wells, taught children to read Arabic script, and introduced new ideas about law, faith, and leadership. The Ghanaian court tolerated these strangers, even welcomed them, but held firm to its traditions. The king remained the bridge between worlds, one foot in the old ways of the ancestors, one listening cautiously to the new rhythm from across the desert in the markets. Gold dust still glimmered, but it now passed through more hands than before. Foreign merchants built their own quarters. Interpreters became indispensable. With each new connection, Ghana's wealth expanded, but so did its dependence on the long, fragile chain of trade. The quiet tension. Every silence carries its own tension. By the 11th century, the empire's borders stretched thin. To the south, forest kingdoms grew bolder. To the north, Berber groups, like the Almoravids, gathered strength, bound by a zeal that saw Ghana's quiet tolerance as weakness. For now, the peace held, but under the calm surface, a question began to form. Could the empire remain both prosperous and unchanged? Could the golden dust that connected worlds also be the thing that pulled them apart? The caravans still crossed the desert, patient as ever. The market still hummed. The king still ruled from behind his walls, his dogs adorned with gold collars. But somewhere in the horizon's shimmer, the wind had shifted slightly, not yet a storm, only the faint whisper of one to come. The sun dips low over Kaumbi Salem. Traders pack their gobes, brushing dust from their robes. A boy scatters millet for the goats. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled thud of drums carries over the wind, a rhythm so ancient it feels like breathing. Tomorrow, the caravans will rise again. They always do, but for how long? By the time the 12th century began to whisper across the Sahel, the empire of Ghana had grown older, slower, and perhaps to still. The rhythm that had once kept caravans and markets in perfect balance began to falter. It did not happen in one sudden break, but in a series of soft, almost invisible changes. A well drying here, a road falling into disuse there, a caravan that did not return. Empires do not always die in battle. Some simply fall asleep. The shift in the sand, the desert, is a patient thief. Over generations, the Sahara moved, grain by grain, swallowing old roots and uncovering new ones. Wells that had watered traders for centuries began to fail. The caravans, guided by instinct and starlight, adjusted their paths slightly west or east. Small diversions that seemed harmless at first, but trade is like water. Once it finds a new channel, it rarely returns to the east. New centers began to rise, places like Tadmeka and Gao, cities that sparkled briefly in the glow once reserved for Ghana. To the west, the Soninke people, who had once formed Ghana's heartland, found themselves watching caravans bypass their markets entirely, drawn instead to newer powers that offered fresh opportunities and safer passage. And then came the winds of faith, stronger now, less gentle than before, the coming of the Almoravids from the north. The Almoravids emerged, desert warriors wrapped in indigo veils, driven by religion and ambition. They were Berbers who had united under a banner of reformist Islam, building an empire that stretched from Morocco into the Western Sahara. Their leaders, austere and devout, viewed the quiet, traditional spirituality of Ghana with suspicion. The Soninke kings, who honored both ancestors and trade gods, represented an old order that the Almoravids sought to reshape. Sometime around the mid-11th century, the Almoravids advanced southward, their caravans no longer peaceful. Historians still debate what happened, whether Ghana was truly invaded or merely entangled in the wake of this religious expansion. Some say the Almoravids conquered Kambi Sela briefly. Others argue they simply diverted trade, weakening the kingdom from without. Whatever the truth, the effect was unmistakable. Ghana's silence deepened. The once bustling markets grew thinner. The steady exchange of salt and gold slowed to a hesitant trickle. The king's court, once resplendent in gold, now presided over a smaller world, one where the hum of trade had turned to echo. The kingdom divided within Ghana itself. Unity began to fray. As trade waned, local chiefs grew restless. The wealth that had once tied them to the capital now seemed too distant, too faint. In some regions, the younger generations began to turn their gaze southward, toward the forests and rivers that promised new goldfields and new beginnings. These migrations carried with them the memory of Ghana's order. They would eventually give rise to other powers, Mali, Songhai, and countless smaller kingdoms that inherited the habits of weighing, taxing, and trusting that Ghana had first refined. In the twilight of the 12th century, Ghana itself was fading, not destroyed, but dispersed. Like gold dust lifted by a sigh of wind, the quiet fall of Kambi Selahim. The twin cities still stand, but their edges crumble. The great market square is quieter. The traders still come, but fewer each season. Some buildings have collapsed into soft mounds of earth. Others stand half buried in drifting sand. The palace remains a shell of its former self. The king's golden bracelets, once heavy on his wrists, now rest in a chest that is opened less often. The drums that once announced his presence are silent except on ceremonial days. Even the sacred dogs, those gold-collared guardians, wander idly in the courtyards, their collars tarnished by time. Outside the city, the wells grow shallower. The desert encroaches, and the people adapt in small, practical ways, rebuilding their huts farther south, tending smaller flocks, bartering with new neighbors. Life continues, but not the empire. The Ghana that once dazzled travelers now breathes more slowly, its heartbeat faint but steady, like the slow rhythm of a sleeping world. The passing of gold still flows, but now through different hands. New rulers in Mali begin to dominate the trade routes. They claim the goldfields once under Ghana's watch, and with them the world's attention. The story shifts, as stories always do, toward new names: Sundiata, Mansa Musa, Timbuktu. Yet even these later empires, magnificent in their wealth, carried Ghana's quiet fingerprints. They inherited her systems of tribute, her markets of order, her unspoken rules of exchange. The dust of Ouagadougou lingered, invisible but indelible, in the foundations of every city that came after in time. Even the name Ghana faded from local memory, remembered only by foreign scribes and the descendants of traders who once touched its markets. When archaeologists uncovered Kambi Salet centuries later, they found the faint outlines of walls, bits of pottery, and traces of melted gold in the soil, the last physical whispers of a civilization that preferred silence to spectacle. What remains to listen for Ghana today? You must listen carefully, not for ruins or relics, but for rhythms. In the Sahel, some still measure gold by dust instead of coin. In small markets, from Mali to Senegal, traders greet one another, not with loud haggling but with patient silence, a hand extended, a nod given, echoes of a barter practiced 1,000 years ago. Even the idea of trust in trade, so essential to African markets across centuries, can trace a thin golden line back to Ghana. It was there that commerce became ritual, where silence became law, and where gold, that restless metal, was taught to move quietly. Ghana's greatness was not in conquest or monument. It was in the calmness with which it managed power. In a world of storms, it was content to be a still pool, reflective, golden, and deep. The golden afterglow's night falls over the forgotten plains of Ouagadougou. The air cools. The sand glows faintly under the moon, and for a moment, you might almost believe you can hear the distant murmur of trade, the creak of leather, the shuffle of hooves, the soft jingle of metal against wood. But it's only the wind, the same wind that once carried the scent of gold dust through the market at Kambi Salet. Empires rise and fall, but silence endures. And in that silence, something of Ghana remains patient, shining, and unhurried. When the last trader left Kambi Salet, he likely did not think of history or legacy. He simply followed the path south, where rumor said the rivers gleamed with new gold. The desert closed behind him, soft as a sigh, and so ended the first kingdom of gold, not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet closing of a market at dusk. The desert begins long before you see it. First comes the thinning of the trees, then the soil turning pale and brittle underfoot, then a horizon that seems to flatten the world itself. The air grows weightless, dry enough to sting. You taste dust before you can see it. And then, after miles of quiet nothing, the ground begins to shine. That shimmer is Taghaza, a town made of salt. Every wall, every mosque, every sleeping mat, every seat inside the Sultan's house, all carved from the same white mineral that covers the desert floor. In the noonday sun, it glows with a brilliance so harsh that travelers must cover their eyes with cloth, lest they go blind from the reflection. This is the Sahara's hidden wealth, not gold, not silver, but salt, the substance that keeps food from rotting, that replaces what the body loses to heat, that turns survival into something possible. To outsiders, Taghaza seems like a mirage. To those who live and work here, it is both prison and treasure. The white city imagine arriving at Taghaza in the 14th century. From a distance, the settlement looks like an outcrop of chalk, a geometric ghost rising from the desert. The wind hisses endlessly, pushing thin curtains of sand over the low walls. The air carries a taste of metal and dryness that never leaves the tongue. The people who live here are miners, men hardened by silence and sun. Most are enslaved laborers, captured or traded from distant regions. Others are free men who chose the desert's harsh wage over the hunger of the Sahel. All share the same daily rhythm. Rise before dawn. Work until the sun becomes unbearable. Rest in narrow shade. Then return underground when the light softens. There are no gardens, no wells of sweet water. Water must be carried in from afar, sloshing in goatskin bags. A single cup can cost a man a day's labor. Even so, salt rules here. It replaces the stone that nature denied. It builds walls where clay would crumble, and when night falls, it glows faintly beneath the moon, like the bones of the earth exposed to air. Inside the miners' huts, salt dust coats everything, the mats, the food, even the skin. It burns the eyes and cracks the lips. But the people have learned to live with it, to breathe it, to treat it almost as a companion. For in this world, salt is not simply life, it is identity. The work beneath the white teach morning. Miners descend into open pits that stretch like wounds across the plain. The tools are simple: wooden picks, iron chisels, baskets of woven fiber. They chip at the earth until the white blocks break free, thick slabs, each one weighing as much as a man's torso. The salt comes out in layers, the top coarse and yellowed with dust, the lower layers pure and crystalline. The miners load the slabs onto sleds or donkeys, stacking them with careful precision. Each slab must remain whole. A crack can cut its value in half. When a pile is ready, they smear the blocks with camel fat or oil to keep the air from leaching their moisture away. Every sound echoes strangely here: the strike of pick on stone, the grunt of men hauling the slabs, the faint rattle of pebbles, all swallowed by the vastness above. There is no vegetation, no bird call, no running water, only the human breath, the tools, and the whisper of sand sliding over salt. By midday, the sun drives them out of the pits. They crouch in the narrow shade of salt walls, chewing dried dates or millet cakes. Conversation is rare. The men's lips are often too dry to move much, and besides, there is little to say. Each day is identical to the last. In Taghaza, time does not pass. It accumulates, layer upon layer, like the salt itself. The value of salt to those who live beyond the desert. Salt may seem ordinary, but in the medieval world, it was one of the most precious substances known. Without it, no army could march, no meat could last the journey across the dunes, no human body could survive the dry winds. Salt was traded weight for weight with gold in the markets of West Africa. The slabs from Taghaza became currency, carried by camel caravans to Timbuktu, Walata, and Kaumbi Salad, where they were exchanged for gold, dust, ivory, and slaves. Each block was stamped with markings to show its mine of origin, proof of authenticity, like the mint mark on a coin. The Malian Empire, which by this time had inherited much of Ghana's old trade network, taxed every caravan that entered or left Taghaza. Even in this lonely outpost, the empire's reach was felt. Officials stationed there oversaw the counting of slabs and the collection of tribute. A portion of the salt went directly to the king's stores, where it was redistributed to other provinces. So while the miners sweated in silence, far away in Niani, Mali's royal capital, nobles feasted on salted meat and traded in the very blocks cut from Taghaza's pits. The desert's suffering became the world's sustenance, the caravan's arrival every few weeks. The horizon begins to shimmer with movement. Lines of camels approach slowly, each burdened with supplies and empty sacks. The air fills with the soft groaning of animals, the creak of leather, the murmur of foreign voices. These are the merchants of the Sahara, Tuareg, Berber, and Arab traders, coming to collect their due. They bring food, tools, water, and sometimes letters or news from distant lands. In exchange, they take the white slabs, load them with careful balance, and tie them down in groups of 5 or 6 per camel. When they leave, the miners watch them disappear into the haze, each caravan carrying away weeks of labor. They will follow the ancient routes north toward Sijamasa or south toward Timbuktu, tracing the invisible paths that bind the desert together. The departure always feels the same, a mix of relief and envy. The miners envy the travelers for their motion, for the simple privilege of leaving this blinding prison behind. The travelers envy the miners for their claim on the source of such wealth. Yet neither could exist without the other. The desert binds them equally in dependence and distance. The sound of survival at night. Taghaza becomes almost gentle. The wind cools, the salt loses its glare, and the town hums faintly with low voices. Fires cannot burn here. There is no wood, so the people use dried camel dung to cook their evening meals. The smell mingles with the faint sweetness of boiling grain. Miners mend tools by moonlight, using bits of iron brought from the north. Some carve small figures or amulets from the discarded salt blocks, crude, featureless shapes that they keep by their mats for luck. Others lie silently on their backs, staring at the stars, their skin gleaming white from salt dust, as if they themselves were part of the desert's mineral body. There is no laughter here, but there is endurance. And endurance, in this place, is its own kind of pride. The visitor's accounts, the world beyond Taghaza, knew of it only through travelers' tales. The Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, who crossed the Sahara in the 14th century, wrote of Taghaza with weary astonishment. He described a town built entirely of salt, roofed with camel skins, where the only food came from caravans, and the only water was briny and unfit to drink. Yet he marveled that men still lived there, calling it a place of wealth beyond reason, but of misery beyond measure. The irony was sharp. The men of Taghaza lived among riches, but could not taste them. The salt that made empires rich made their throats ache with thirst. The white walls that glittered in sunlight blinded them slowly. It was a kingdom where value and suffering shared the same form, and still they worked, because the desert demanded it. And because the world demanded salt, the weight of white. You could stand at the edge of a Taghaza pit at sunset. You would see something strange, beauty and desolation, perfectly balanced. The slabs glow faintly pink under the dying light. The air stills, and the miners' shadows stretch across the pits like dark veins. The silence feels immense, almost sacred. 1,000 miles away, someone is seasoning a stew with a pinch of this very salt. A trader in Timbuktu is weighing gold against a block cut here. A king is collecting tribute made of the same substance these men stacked with bleeding hands. It is an empire of connections, all tied to this one place, this city of salt and shadows. And as the stars rise over the white plain, the miners turn inward, curling into their salt huts, closing their eyes against the cold that creeps after dark. The desert, for all its brutality, gives them this one mercy, a silence deep enough for sleep, but in the stillness, a question begins to take shape, whispered not in words, but in the weary rhythm of breath. How long can a city made entirely of salt survive the very wind that feeds it? When the morning sun rises over Taghaza, the first thing you notice is the movement not of people, but of camels. Hundreds of them, tethered in patient lines, each groaning softly as handlers adjust the ropes and packs. Their shadows stretch long across the white ground, like dark stitches sewn into the desert. This is the beginning of a caravan, the slow-beating heart of Saharan trade. Each camel will carry around 200 kilograms, 6 to 8 salt slabs from Taghaza's pits, wrapped tightly in palm fiber and oilcloth. Each handler is responsible for several animals, walking beside them through hundreds of miles of nothingness. The journey ahead will take weeks, perhaps months, across dunes so vast that even stars seem uncertain of direction. And yet, this was one of the most dependable systems in the medieval world, a rhythm of endurance, trust, and calculation that sustained empires. The rhythm of the caravan does not travel like an army. It moves more like a tide, deliberate, fluid, patient. At dawn, the men rise in the cold air and feed their camels small mouthfuls of grain. They tighten saddles, check water skins, and recite quiet prayers before departure. By the time the sun lifts clear of the horizon, the line begins to move, slow, swaying, almost hypnotic. Each camel's hoof sinks into the sand with a faint sighing sound. Dust rises behind them and lingers, glittering in the air. There are no paths, only routes memorized through generations. The caravan's guides, the Azoli, carry the knowledge in their minds, distances between wells, shapes of dunes, stars that point north, and stones placed long ago as markers by other travelers. To lose the route is to lose one's life. At midday, when the sun becomes unbearable, they rest. The animals kneel in clusters, long necks folding down gracefully, while the men crouch in their shadows. The silence is immense, broken only by the creak of leather and the faint breathing of camels. They eat little dried dates, millet cakes, sometimes salted fish from the Niger. Then, as the light softens again, they rise and continue. Travel by night is safest. The heat lessens, the stars guide them, and the desert seems almost gentle. The rhythm repeats, day after day, until time itself begins to dissolve. Every sound, every movement becomes a ritual of survival. The path to Timbuktu, journey from Taghaza to Timbuktu, one of the key arteries of the trans-Saharan trade, could take up to 40 days. Timbuktu was more than a city. It was a crossroads of empires, perched on the edge of the Niger River, like a resting point between two worlds. To the north stretched the desert's void. To the south, the fertile lands of Mali, Songhai, and beyond. As the caravan approaches the Sahel, the air begins to change. The dryness softens. The scent of grass and distant water drifts faintly through the wind. The white salt slabs, so blinding in Taghaza, now gleam softly under a gentler sun. When the caravan finally reaches the city, there is no celebration, only the quiet business of exchange. Salt for gold, salt for slaves, salt for cloth and grain. In the crowded markets, Mandinka and Tuareg merchants haggle in low voices. They speak a dozen languages, yet understand each other through the rhythm of barter. One block of salt might fetch an ounce of gold in lean years. Another might trade for 3 goats, or for a length of dyed cloth from North Africa. The rates change with the season, the harvest, the whispers of rumor. But one truth remains steady: salt always holds its value. The empire's appetite, the royal capital of Niani, salt was more than a trade good, it was a matter of policy. The Malian emperors understood that whoever controlled salt controlled survival. Their wealth in gold was legendary, but gold alone could not feed or preserve an empire spread across forests, rivers, and desert. Every household, from the humblest farmer to the royal kitchen, depended on salt from Taghaza and other mines. Without it, food spoiled, armies grew weak, merchants fell ill on the road. Salt was life's preservative, both literal and symbolic. The emperor, or Mansa, imposed a tax on every slab that entered or left Taghaza. Caravans were required to stop at checkpoints along the way, where scribes recorded quantities and collected dues. Some of this salt went directly to the imperial storehouses, some to soldiers as rations, and some to foreign merchants who paid in gold dust. Through these silent transactions, the empire's power stretched invisibly across thousands of miles. The white slabs from Taghaza became the bones of an economic body, unseen but essential. Salt as currency in the medieval Sahel, salt was not merely a commodity, it was money. It circulated as blocks and fragments, traded in markets, and used to settle debts. Travelers would sometimes carry small chunks of salt wrapped in leather, the way one might carry coins. In some regions, slabs of salt were literally used as units of value, their sizes standardized for convenience. The word for salt and the word for wealth were often the same in local languages. To be rich in salt was to be secure. To lose one's salt was to fall into hunger. Merchants treated salt with reverence. Before carving a slab, they murmured brief blessings to the desert. When a piece broke unevenly, it was sometimes seen as a sign, a warning of drought or bad fortune. The desert, after all, was not just geography. It was a god of sorts, capable of both giving and taking. The desert's tollbooth, the journey always exacted its price. Many caravans never reached their destinations. A wrong turn, a failed well, or a sudden sandstorm could erase entire groups from existence. The desert offered no graves, only shifting dunes that swallowed men and animals alike. Those who survived learned to read the land's moods. They watched the color of the sand, the behavior of the wind, the movement of the stars. In this way, survival itself became a kind of language, one spoken by the skin and bone, even for those who made it safely. The desert left its marks, cracked lips, white dust embedded in clothing, eyes reddened from glare, and yet they continued, because each journey, no matter how dangerous, tied one life to another, miner to merchant, merchant to noble, noble to king. The whisper networks, despite its vast emptiness, the desert carried information like an underground river. News traveled with the caravans, slow, filtered, but steady. From the north came tales of Moroccan dynasties and Andalusian scholars. From the south, reports of local revolts or new gold finds. Traders brought not just goods, but knowledge, stories, songs, and even rumors that would alter the shape of empires. A single conversation at a desert well could change trade routes or spark alliances. A whispered warning about bandits or failing wells might save an entire caravan. And through these invisible exchanges, the Sahara, so often imagined as a void, became a network of human connection. To listen to the desert was to learn its politics. When gold meets white in Timbuktu's markets, the salt blocks from Taghaza sat beside pouches of fine gold dust from the Bambouk and Bure mines. The two substances seemed opposites, one heavy and pale, the other light and glowing, yet they depended utterly on each other. Gold was the measure of beauty and power. Salt was the measure of life. One fed the soul, the other the body. Together they built the economies of West Africa for a brief time. In the 14th and 15th centuries, this balance created a kind of fragile harmony. Taghaza's miners toiled in silence. The desert's traders moved in patient rhythm. The cities along the Niger thrived on their exchanges. And the empire of Mali stood as the hinge between two worlds, desert and river, salt and gold, survival and abundance. The empire listens to the wind, but even as trade flourished, a quiet tension grew. The salt mines of Taghaza were far to the north, vulnerable, remote, and exposed. The caravans, though loyal to Mali, were often manned by Berber tribes, whose allegiance wavered with profit. Rumors began to drift across the dunes that the Songhai were rising to the east, that Morocco's sultans watched Mali's wealth with covetous eyes, that the desert's loyalty could shift as easily as the sand itself. And so the empire listened to the wind, to the merchants, to the whispers at the wells. For as much as Mali controlled the salt, it could never truly control the desert. The same white slabs that fed the empire's strength might someday mark its decline. The desert does not remember who rules it. It only remembers who endures as the caravan leaves Timbuktu once again. Heading north toward Taghaza, the wind rises behind it, carrying grains of salt back into the sky, where they vanish like snowflakes in sunlight. And somewhere, deep within the emperor's palace. The Mansa wonders quietly, what happens to an empire when its wealth depends on a land it cannot tame? The desert does not conquer by battle. It wins through persistence, the same endless, grinding patience that wears down even the strongest stones. And so it was with Taghaza, the white city of salt, which did not fall to sword or siege, but to the slow betrayal of time. When the 14th century began to wane, the once mighty Malian Empire began to loosen its hold on the north. The caravans still moved, the taxes still flowed, but the empire's grip on the desert had become faint. A rumor carried on dry wind, and in that gap, new powers began to stir. The shadow of Songhito, the east. On the great bend of the Niger River, the city of Gao rose in prominence. It had always been a trading post, but under the leadership of Sunni Ali in the 15th century, it became something more, a military engine, swift and calculating. Songhai's soldiers rode not in long caravans, but in small, deadly bands. Moving along the river like shadows, they looked to the north and saw Taghaza. It was a city that did not belong to its laborers, nor even to the merchants who traveled there. It belonged to whoever could protect it, whoever could claim the trade routes that fed it. And so, Songhai extended its reach into the desert, sending envoys, merchants, and then soldiers. The miners continued their work, indifferent to which empire's flag fluttered in the dry wind, so long as the caravans kept coming, and the salt could still be sold. But power in the desert was never permanent. It was seasonal, like rain. The Moroccan gaze far to the north. In the marble courts of Marrakesh, another power watched these changes with growing interest. The Moroccan sultans, first the Marinids, then the Saadians, coveted the gold and salt that had enriched Mali and now fed Songhai. They called it the wealth of the south, a fortune carried on, Camelback, to the Moroccans. Taghaza was both distant and essential, the beating heart of the trans-Saharan trade. Controlling it meant controlling the artery that linked sub-Saharan gold to North African markets. But the desert was a wall of fire and wind, and few dared to cross it without necessity, until, one day, necessity arrived. By the late 16th century, Morocco's coffers were thin. Wars and court luxuries had drained the treasury. The Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, known as the Golden, decided to take what he could not buy, Songhai's wealth. And the first step in that campaign was to seize Taghaza, the invasion of Saltine 1591. A Moroccan force, 6,000 men strong, led by Judor Pasha, a Spanish-born eunuch in the Sultan's service, set out across the Sahara. They carried muskets, a rarity in Africa at the time, and their arrival would soon rewrite the balance of empires. When they reached Taghaza, they found no fortifications, no garrison, only huts and walls of salt, and miners who looked up from their pits in wordless disbelief. There was nothing to conquer, because Taghaza was not a city in the way cities are meant to be. It was a workplace, a furnace of endurance. Judor Pasha claimed it in the Sultan's name, raised Morocco's flag, and continued south toward Songhai's capital. But in doing so, he had broken the fragile thread that kept Taghaza alive. For once, the miners fled and the caravans were disrupted. There was no one left to rebuild what the desert began to reclaim. The silence that followed the Moroccans did not stay long. They found the place unbearable, no fresh water, no shade, no rest. Even their camels suffered. The soldiers complained that the very walls they leaned against burned their hands. Within months, they abandoned Taghaza, leaving behind only bones, empty sacks, and the faint smell of brine. The miners who once lived there did not return. They moved southward, establishing new settlements near Taudeni, another salt mine further into Mali's domain. In a way, Taghaza simply migrated, not as a place, but as a trade. The salt itself continued to flow, but the city that had once glowed white beneath the sun became a ruin, erased by the same winds that had sustained it. Travelers who passed by in later centuries wrote of seeing only broken walls and hollow pits. Ibn Khaldun described it as a place eaten by the earth. Others spoke of the eerie silence, then disappeared into haze by noon. No one could tell where the buildings had stood. The desert had swallowed its geometry whole. The empire of absence, the fall of Taghaza, marked more than the end of a mining town. It signaled a shift in how Africa's interior connected to the world. The trans-Saharan trade routes, once lifelines of empire, began to lose their power. European ships had begun to sail along the western coast, bypassing the desert altogether. Salt could be mined elsewhere. Gold could be taken by sea, and so the desert's great economy, its invisible web of trust and endurance, began to unravel quietly. What replaced it was not conquest, but absence. The caravan bells fell silent. The wells dried. The wind filled the empty pits with drifting sand. The desert closed its mouth. The memory of Sultanate Taghaza was never truly lost. For centuries after, storytellers in Timbuktu spoke of the city of white, where men once built homes of salt and slept under roofs that glowed like moonlight. Miners at Taudeni still told tales of ancestors who had worked the first mine, whose ghosts whispered when the wind blew from the north. In some versions, they say Taghaza's walls still stand far beneath the dunes, preserved by the very dryness that destroyed it. In others, they say it sank into the earth, turning the ground itself into salt, so that every grain of the desert carries a trace of its memory. There is no proof of either. But the Sahara does not need proof. It remembers in silence what remains today. All that's left of Taghaza are fragments, shallow pits, half-buried walls, and the faint imprint of human hands on salt. The wind smooths them a little more each year. The dunes shift, and the past rearranges itself again. But if you were to stand there alone, with the sun pressing down and the air shimmering white, the rhythm of the caravan, the murmur of men weighing salt against gold, you might hear the echo of waterskins creaking, or the low groan of camels waiting to depart. And in that moment, you would understand that Taghaza was never really a city at all. It was a contract between human need and nature's indifference, a temporary compromise that lasted impossibly for centuries. The reflection, the story of Taghaza, is not one of heroism or collapse, but of balance, the strange equilibrium between human endurance and environmental cruelty. It reminds us that civilization is often built not on abundance, but on scarcity. The men who mined salt in Taghaza did not seek glory. They sought survival, and in doing so, they kept the world's empires alive, perhaps in the end. Every empire is a version of Taghaza, shining briefly beneath the sun, built from something fragile something that the wind will one day reclaim. Timbuktu begins not as a city, but as a mirage. From a distance, the flat Sahel seems to stretch endlessly, a pale expanse of grass and dust. Then, like a secret opening in the desert, low clay walls emerge. Earthen towers catch the sunlight, casting long shadows across sandy streets. Palm fronds rustle faintly above wells, and the air smells faintly of millet, spices, and distant rivers. By the 14th century, Timbuktu was already a hub of commerce, a city whose quiet streets carried wealth from the forests of the south to the deserts of the north. Its markets were filled with people who spoke a dozen languages, moved in unspoken harmony, and measured trust not in loud agreements but in gestures, nods, and the careful inspection of goods. Among the most coveted commodities was gold, not in nuggets or coins, but in dust, carefully weighed and transferred from sack to scale. The Sahel's rivers carried gold from distant forests. The miners of Bambuk, Bure, and Lobi regions washed it from sand and riverbeds. Then came the caravans, transporting it north to markets like Timbuktu, where it would be exchanged for salt, textiles, and other essentials. The market's rhythms, the streets of Timbuktu, moved like water, even when they appeared still. Merchants sat cross-legged on mats, their scales laid out before them. Each transaction was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Dusty fingers lifted fine grains of gold, dropping them onto tiny metal plates. Hands balanced weights, sometimes in silence, sometimes accompanied by quiet counting in local tongues. Negotiation was subtle. No one shouted, no one rushed. To haggle loudly would suggest desperation or inexperience. Instead, the air was filled with gestures, tilting of scales, a careful adjustment of pouches, a faint nod that signaled agreement. Every gesture was observed, interpreted, and responded to with precision. For an outsider, the market may have seemed slow, almost tedious, but for those who traded here daily, each movement was essential, each pause deliberate. The city's wealth depended not only on gold, but on the unspoken understanding that the exchange must be fair, or risk the entire system collapsing. The gold traders, the traders themselves, came from diverse backgrounds. Some were Tuareg, carrying salt from northern mines. Others were Mandinka, transporting gold from southern rivers. Arab merchants arrived with cloth and beads from across the Sahara and beyond, while local Malink intermediaries orchestrated exchanges between the two. They all shared a common trait: patience. Gold trading required careful observation, meticulous counting, and the ability to detect the faintest irregularity in a scale. One careless hand, one miscounted grain, and trust could be broken, sometimes permanently. These men lived quietly, rising before dawn to inspect the market and closing their shops only after the sun had fallen behind the horizon. Their homes were modest: clay walls, palm frond roofs, and mats where families slept. Yet, within these simple structures, records were kept, contracts inscribed, and letters carried along the desert winds to distant trading partners. Every day was a lesson in endurance, precision, and patience. The architecture of Timbuktu's buildings reflected its economic culture. Walls were built of sun-baked mud, offering insulation against the desert's extremes. Courtyards provided space for private negotiation. Narrow alleys controlled the flow of people, ensuring that traders could interact without chaos. There were no grand palaces here. The grandeur of the city was measured in the integrity of its commerce, not the height of its towers. Even the mosques played a role. Not just spiritual centers, they also served as meeting points for scholars and merchants. The quiet discipline of prayer mirrored the discipline of trade, methodical, respectful, and deeply reliant on rules understood but not always spoken aloud. In Timbuktu, religion, economy, and daily life intertwined. One could study the Quran in the morning, weigh gold dust in the afternoon, and listen to news from caravans at dusk, all without leaving the city's narrow streets. The caravans shaped the rhythm of the city more than any ruler. From the north came camels, heavy with salt, textiles, and sometimes manuscripts. From the south arrived canoes carrying gold dust, ivory, cola nuts, and rare forest products. These caravans were slow-moving, measured, deliberate. One misstep along the Sahel's rivers or the desert's edges could ruin the entire journey. When they arrived, the city shifted. Traders checked weights, guards inspected cargo, and secret ledgers were consulted. Even a brief delay could ripple through Timbuktu's economy, altering prices, upsetting balances, and requiring recalculation. Every day, the city adapted to the needs of the desert and the river, balancing scarcity and abundance with the patience of someone who knows that survival is quiet, slow, and fragile. The invisible web. The city's power came not from armies or fortifications, but from information. Traders carried not only gold, but knowledge of distant markets, political changes, famine, or conflict. One whisper in the marketplace could shift trade routes, redirect caravans, and change the fortunes of merchants far from Timbuktu. Every transaction in gold carried this invisible weight. A grain of dust, a slightly heavier scale, a note exchanged between merchants, all could influence thousands of lives stretching across deserts and rivers. Timbuktu thrived on this subtle network, an empire built on attention, patience, and trust rather than spectacle or conquest. Evening in the marketplace, the sun dips low, the city softens. Shadows lengthen along the walls, camels kneel in their pens, and the traders gather quietly to count and secure their gold. The air carries the faint scent of roasted millet, dried fish, and smoke from small cooking fires. Conversations drop to whispers. The market, which hummed all day with the silent energy of exchange, slows to a muted heartbeat. Children play along the alleys, careful not to disturb a merchant's scale. Dogs lie in the corners. The city exhales, preparing for the night. And even in this calm, one cannot forget the weight of history. Every grain of gold in Timbuktu had passed through countless hands, across dangerous deserts, through salt mines, river crossings, and finally, into this quiet marketplace. The city's survival depended on the same patience that kept the desert caravans moving, a rhythm measured in silence, trust, and meticulous care. As darkness falls over Timbuktu, the air cools and the streets empty slowly. One question remains, almost unspoken. How long can a city built entirely on invisible threads of trust and gold survive the pressures of ambition, climate, and shifting trade? Timbuktu is a city that whispers. It does not announce itself with walls or armies. Its presence is measured in the quiet rhythm of footsteps on packed earth, the soft sliding of camel hooves, and the subtle clinking of gold dust being weighed on delicate scales. But beyond the marketplace, beyond the scent of roasted millet and sun-baked mud, lies another wealth, one no caravan can carry and no scale can measure. Here, knowledge is currency as potent as gold. The manuscript houses among the low clay walls of Timbuktu are miscut libraries, private collections that contain hundreds, sometimes thousands, of manuscripts. These texts are written on soft parchment or carefully prepared cotton, inscribed with ink that gleams black in the sunlight. They cover subjects, both practical and philosophical: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, Islamic jurisprudence, poetry, and natural science. Traders and scholars alike consult them, sometimes to resolve disputes, sometimes to plan journeys, sometimes to understand the flow of the Niger and the patterns of the desert. Every manuscript is fragile, every word is precious, and yet, despite their vulnerability, they are handled daily, read aloud, copied by scribes, and traded discreetly among scholars. Knowledge here is living, circulating invisibly, like a secondary river flowing beneath the city's physical markets. The merchant scholars in Timbuktu. Traders are often scholars, and scholars are often traders. A man might spend his mornings examining ledgers of gold dust, ensuring that every grain balances with a weight that has been calibrated meticulously for decades. By afternoon, he could be in a manuscript house, comparing river calculations for caravan planning, or studying a treatise on medicine to understand the health of his laborers. This duality is not incidental. Survival in Timbuktu requires it. Gold is transient. Caravans can be lost to sandstorms, bandits, or political strife. Knowledge, however, is portable and enduring. A single calculation, a map drawn on parchment, or a ledger entry can guide future traders safely through the desert, or provide insight into crop cycles and river levels months or years in advance. It is a quiet form of power, invisible, methodical, patient, and just as vital as the gold in the marketplace. The silent negotiations. Timbuktu's wealth is maintained, not only by trade, but by the subtle dance of reputation. In the marketplace, merchants rarely shout. They speak in gestures, in the careful placement of scales, in the rhythm of their counting. But in the manuscript houses, negotiation takes a different form. Scholars barter knowledge. A treatise on astronomy might be exchanged for advice on a new trade route. A medical text might be lent in return for a precise calculation of gold purity. All exchanges are bound by trust and discretion. Breaking it could mean ruin for both economic and intellectual capital. The city survives on these invisible agreements, the silent protocols that dictate who can trade, who can teach, and who can travel safely across deserts whose hazards are as ancient as the dunes themselves. The flow of gold and ideas gold from the rivers of Bambouk and Bure continues to arrive in Timbuktu, carried by slow-moving caravans that have passed the salt-mining cities, the dusty villages, and the vast stretches of the Sahel. But Timbuktu's traders understand that their true advantage lies in pairing wealth with wisdom. A merchant who knows the desert's winds, the location of hidden wells, and the political alliances of distant cities can protect his caravans. A merchant who reads the manuscripts, consults the scholars, and listens to the subtle warnings whispered in the city's quiet corners can multiply the city's fortune many times over. Here, gold and knowledge are mirrors of each other, one tangible, the other invisible. One traded openly, the other circulated secretly. Together, they sustain not just a market, but an entire urban ecosystem. The river as lifeline, though, Timbuktu sits on the edge of the desert. The Niger River is its hidden heartbeat. It is the source of water, of fish, and of fertile soil nearby. Boats bring goods from villages upriver, supplementing what the caravans deliver. And more subtly, the river provides a rhythm for the city's life, a calendar of low waters and high waters, of harvests and shortages that dictates when traders should travel, when scholars might teach, and when merchants must store their gold in anticipation of scarcity. The interplay of desert, river, and city is delicate. The slightest miscalculation, a caravan lost, a drought unanticipated, a river rising too soon, can ripple through every household, every market stall, and every manuscript house. Survival is therefore not merely physical, it is calculative, anticipatory, and patient. The quiet enforcement of Order Timbuktu had no massive armies to protect its wealth. Its defense lay in rules, ritual, and routine. A merchant caught cheating could face social ruin, a slow, insidious punishment far worse than any physical attack. Caravan leaders relied on the honor system. Each member's reputation determined whether future traders would risk traveling with him. Scholars maintained the continuity of knowledge through careful copying and verification, ensuring that misinformation or deception was rare. This quiet governance created a city where trust was enforced not by force, but by necessity. The gold traded in Timbuktu remained secure because the people depended on one another to survive. To betray the system was to endanger not just oneself, but the entire network of commerce and scholarship that sustained the city. Evening in Timbuktu. As the sun sets, the marketplace empties gradually. The scales are covered, the mats rolled, the pouches of gold stored securely. The scent of cooking fires drifts faintly through the streets. Families gather quietly in their clay homes. Scholars close manuscripts and tuck them safely into wooden cases. The city breathes with a rhythm of careful diligence, of preparation for the next caravan, the next negotiation, the next reading. It is a rhythm that has persisted for decades, perhaps centuries, and which relies entirely on the continuity of patience, discipline, and silent communication. And yet, as night deepens and stars emerge over the sky, one cannot help but wonder, for a city so delicately balanced on trust and gold, how long can it maintain its wealth before the pressures of ambition, conquest, or climate tip the scale? Timbuktu's streets once hummed with a quiet rhythm, the delicate clink of scales, the soft shuffle of sandals on sun-baked earth, the whispered consultations between scholars and traders. But over time, the invisible threads that held the city together began to loosen. By the late 16th century, the city had already endured centuries of commerce, conquest, and desert survival. The gold of the South still arrived, and manuscripts continued to circulate among scholars. But the balance was no longer certain. Political changes to the north and east brought new pressures. The Moroccan invasion of the Songhai Empire in 1591 disrupted the trade networks that had carried gold and salt across the Sahara for generations. Timbuktu, once a central hub, became increasingly isolated. Caravans from distant mines were fewer, delayed. Merchants faced longer journeys, harsher conditions, and rising risks from both desert hazards and the threat of bandits exploiting weakened security. The shifting trade networks, the strength of Timbuktu, had always relied on connections river, desert, and road alike. But when Moroccan forces took control of Gao and pressed into former Songhai territories, many merchants began seeking alternative routes. Some moved west toward the Atlantic coast, where emerging European trade posts offered new, though uncertain, opportunities. Others doubled back to safer southern markets along the Niger. The subtle economy of trust, the contracts, the silent agreements, the careful observation of scales began to erode. Traders could no longer rely on the same partners, and with that, the invisible governance of the city weakened. The once thriving marketplaces felt emptier. Mats remained rolled up, merchant scales collected dust, and the echo of footsteps across the streets became less frequent. Knowledge, under threat. Timbuktu's manuscript houses, which had preserved centuries of wisdom, were not immune to these changes. With the decline of trade came the decline of patronage. Families that had supported libraries could no longer afford scribes, and scholars found themselves traveling farther to sustain themselves. Some manuscripts were sold, often to foreign collectors or distant scholars, and others decayed in neglected corners of mud-brick homes. The intellectual network of Timbuktu, once as strong as the caravans themselves, began to fragment. Knowledge that had been meticulously copied, the city's quiet power, built on the precise interplay of commerce and scholarship, was slipping into shadows. Internal pressures, internal strife added to Timbuktu's fragility. Competition among merchants intensified as scarcity of goods increased. Families that had long been allies found themselves in disputes over trade rights, storage, or caravan arrangements. Without strong imperial oversight, the empire's reach weakened by distance, rebellion, and Moroccan incursions. Local enforcement of trade customs became inconsistent. Even the city's scholars felt tension. Rivalries over patronage, religious interpretation, and access to rare manuscripts sometimes escalated into conflict. Where once cooperation had been essential to survival, the growing uncertainty began to unravel the social cohesion that had maintained Timbuktu's quiet order for so long. The human cost, despite its decline, life in Timbuktu did not end abruptly. The streets still smelled of roasted millet and drying clay. Children still ran between alleyways, and traders still negotiated over dusted scales of gold. But the rhythm had changed. Gold continued to flow, but less predictably. Knowledge continued to circulate, but more cautiously. The city's residents adapted as they always had, but with a growing awareness that the golden equilibrium they had relied upon for centuries was no longer guaranteed. Men and women who had once measured wealth in dust now measured it in security, survival, and continuity. They learned again the lessons of the desert: patience, resilience, and the careful management of fragile systems. The shadows of Timbuktu. By the 17th century, Timbuktu was no longer the uncontested jewel of the Sahel. Its markets were quieter, its caravans slower, and its manuscripts dispersed. The city that had mirrored the wealth of rivers and deserts now reflected the fragility of human endeavor. Yet even in decline, Timbuktu remained remarkable. Its libraries still housed knowledge from centuries past. Its streets still carried the faint rhythm of commerce. Its inhabitants still maintained the habits, the discipline, and the patience that had made survival possible in a city built on gold, trust, and invisible rules. It is a reminder that civilizations do not always fall with a roar. Sometimes they fade gradually, like the soft, persistent echo of footsteps on sand. Reflection: the story of Timbuktu teaches us about balance and vulnerability. A city can thrive on gold, knowledge, and trust, yet remain dependent on invisible networks that, if disrupted, leave even the most sophisticated systems fragile. Timbuktu endured for centuries, not because of armies or walls, but because its people understood the quiet rules of survival, the importance of patience, and the value of careful observation and still. One cannot help but ponder how many of today's cities, empires, and systems rely on equally delicate threads of trust, unseen by most, yet essential to survival. The Swahili Coast stretches like a soft ribbon along the Indian Ocean, where turquoise waves lap gently against white sands. Here, the cities rise from the coastline, not with the loud assertion of fortresses, but with a quiet dignity, built from coral stone carved carefully by human hands. Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar each hold their own secret rhythm, a slow pulse of trade, tides, and daily life, measured in whispers and small gestures. The architecture is immediately distinctive. Walls of coral blocks gleam softly under the morning sun, their porous surfaces catching light and shadow. Wooden doors, often decorated with intricate geometric carvings, swing quietly on iron hinges. Narrow streets wind between the houses, their uneven paths worn smooth by generations of bare feet and sandals. The city smells faintly of salt, dried fish, and spices. Clove, cinnamon, and coconut mingle in the air, carried on the breeze that drifts in from the ocean. Boats, small dhows with triangular sails, rest along the harbor, their hulls rocking gently with the tide. This is a city built to endure, to work with the wind and water rather than fight them. Trade winds and daily life. Trade on the Swahili Coast is not frenetic. It is measured, deliberate, and patient. Merchants arrive each morning to inspect their wares: cowrie shells from the Maldives, beads and cloth from India, ivory and gold from the African interior. They sit cross-legged on mats near the harbor, arranging goods with meticulous care. Buyers, visiting traders, local families, or sailors move among them quietly, assessing quality, negotiating prices with subtle gestures, and listening to the soft clatter of scales. Here, patience is a form of currency. A merchant who hurries risks losing both profit and reputation. A buyer who demands loudly risks being refused. The rhythm of the market mirrors the rhythm of the ocean, ebb and flow, constant yet unhurried, requiring observation, timing, and respect. Even the harbor itself participates in this rhythm. The incoming tides dictate the movement of dhows. Cargo is unloaded gradually to avoid tipping fragile stacks of pottery, ivory tusks, or barrels of cloves. Sailors, skilled in reading the currents and wind patterns, anticipate shifts and act quietly, adjusting sails with small, precise gestures. Survival in these ports depends on sensitivity to natural forces as much as to human ones. Kilwa, the heart of the coast. Kilwa, Kisiwani, situated on an island slightly offshore, is the jewel of the Swahili Coast. By the 14th century, it had grown into a center of commerce and governance, yet its presence is understated. The city's coral walls rise silently from the sand. Mosques with carved mihrabs blend seamlessly into the streets. Palaces, though modest in height, project a sense of order and permanence. The city thrives on connections rather than conquest. Merchants maintain relations with inland African kingdoms, the Persian Gulf, India, and even China. Trade agreements are often informal, maintained through trust, reputation, and repeated interaction, rather than written contracts. A single dishonest act can ripple through these networks, affecting trade for months or years. Inside the city, daily life moves with quiet discipline. Families rise early to fetch water from wells or markets. Women prepare food, often rice, fish, and coconut-based sauces, while children run along the streets, careful not to disturb a merchant's display. Each action is deliberate, integrated into the city's rhythm. Like a slow choreography passed down through generations, Mombasa and Zanzibar, ports of connection to the north. Mombasa sits along a natural harbor, protected by reefs and coral outcrops. Its streets are a mixture of stone and sand, and its markets carry the same mixture of local and foreign goods found in Kilwa. Zanzibar, further south, is a hub of clove plantations and a gateway to the interior via dhows and canoes. Though these cities compete economically, they share a cultural and social harmony that supports trade. Mosques, palaces, and marketplaces are designed not only for utility but for cohesion, ensuring that commerce and life coexist quietly, without disruption. Trade here is as much about social connection as profit. A visiting merchant is observed carefully, his manner, his reliability, the subtle signals of his social standing. Those who adhere to the city's unspoken codes find success. Those who do not quickly disappear from the marketplace, remembered only in whispers and cautious tales. Ivory, gold, and cowrie shells. The Swahili Coast is part of a network that extends deep into the African interior. Ivory comes from elephants roaming inland forests, gold from southern rivers, and exotic goods, beads, textiles, and spices arrive from across the Indian Ocean. Each item carries with it stories of distance, labor, and survival. Merchants carefully record the origin and weight of goods, using simple yet precise ledgers, sometimes kept in sand or on wooden tablets. Traders and port officials maintain consistency through repeated observation, cross-checking with other merchants and travelers. Even small errors can have consequences. Misweighed ivory can ruin a reputation. Miscounted cowries can disrupt months of trust-based trade. And in this way, the city thrives on methodical attention to detail, patience, and quiet endurance, the same qualities that allow coral walls to stand for centuries, softened yet strengthened by tides and wind. The ocean, as arbiter, the Indian Ocean itself, is an invisible partner in this economy. Trade depends on its winds, currents, and seasons. Merchants carefully plan departures according to monsoon patterns, waiting months for favorable winds. They map currents, note the swell of tides, and listen to subtle changes in water, color, and bird behavior, all to anticipate the safest, quickest passage. A dhow leaving Kilwa for India may travel over 1,000 nautical miles, but its speed and safety depend entirely on observation, patience, and respect for natural forces. In the Swahili worldview, human ingenuity must coexist with environmental rhythms, not dominate them. Even within the harbor, the ocean exerts influence. Boats are anchored to accommodate tides. Cargo is stacked and secured to withstand swells. Merchants observe how waves interact with coral outcrops and plan the unloading accordingly. This careful, quiet attention underpins the coast's enduring wealth. Evening in the harbors, the sun sets. The streets soften into muted colors. Coral walls glow pink and gold. Markets empty gradually. Dhows rock gently with the tide. Merchants secure goods. Families prepare evening meals. And the harbor exhales slowly, like a living being in these quiet moments. The Swahili cities exist between sea and sand, between trade and survival, between human ambition and nature's rhythm. The day ends not with fireworks or ceremony, but with careful preparation for tomorrow, a continuation of a pattern that has persisted for centuries. And yet, even in this calm, the mind lingers on one question. How long can cities that rely so delicately on wind, tide, and trust endure before the ocean or human ambition changes their quiet balance? The Swahili Coast, with its coral walls and quiet ports, is only one part of a larger system, a network that extends far into the African interior. Here, the city's wealth depends on slow-moving caravans, traversing forests and river valleys, carrying ivory, gold, slaves, and exotic goods from inland kingdoms to the shores of the Indian Ocean. Unlike the bustling harbor, the inland routes are quieter, measured by footsteps, hoofbeats, and the slow cadence of pack animals. Paths wind through dense forests, where sunlight barely touches the ground, across open plains where the wind sculpts grass like waves, and along riverbanks where water levels dictate the speed of travel. For merchants, these routes are as essential as the harbors themselves. Survival here is dictated not by speed, but by discipline, observation, and patience. One misstep, a poorly timed river crossing, a misjudged forest path, or an encounter with hostile terrain could delay caravans for weeks or months, sometimes permanently disrupting trade. Caravan organization. A typical caravan is a study in methodical planning. Camels, donkeys, or oxen are loaded with carefully measured goods. Ivory is wrapped in soft cloth to prevent cracking. Gold dust is sealed in leather pouches and hidden within larger bundles to ensure its safety. Spices are packed to prevent contamination or loss of scent. Merchants carry ledgers, tallying items in a code understood only by themselves or trusted assistants. Travelers rely heavily on guides, often locals familiar with terrain and hidden water sources. The guide's knowledge is both practical and tacit. Which riverbanks are safe to cross? Which forest paths conceal dangerous wildlife? which villages are hospitable to traders, and which may demand excessive tribute. The caravan moves at a deliberately slow pace. Camels and donkeys cannot be hurried without risking injury or death. Humans, too, must conserve strength, ration water, and avoid conflict. Survival is incremental, measured day by day, and success depends on adherence to ritual and observation rather than force or speed. Trade as a delicate network. Every caravan contributes to a web of commerce invisible to most observers. One shipment of ivory, arriving days or weeks late, can cause cascading delays in coastal markets. Gold dust, delayed or miscounted, affects not only the merchants in Kilwa or Mombasa, but also inland kingdoms that rely on its exchange for salt, cloth, or weapons. The inland economy is trust-based. Agreements made months in advance are honored across hundreds of miles. A merchant's reputation follows him along the trail, affecting future negotiations in distant towns. One misstep, cheating, miscounting, or failing to deliver goods can erode credibility, cutting off trade and threatening survival for years. In this way, the inland caravans are as much about social contracts as they are about material exchange. Survival depends on human patience, discretion, and subtle observation. The forest kingdoms, many of the coastal goods originate in forested inland kingdoms. Here, laborers extract ivory from elephants, harvest spices, and collect exotic goods. Local rulers oversee these operations, ensuring that caravans can depart safely while maintaining political control over resources. Laborers work quietly, often in isolation, measuring their output meticulously. Ivory is shaped, cleaned, and prepared. Spices are dried and sorted. Gold is weighed and sealed. Every step is necessary, precise, and deliberate. Even small errors can lead to financial loss or social tension. The forest kingdoms rely on coastal cities for markets, yet they also depend on their own systems of accountability. Both ends of the trade network, inland and coastal, are sustained by this shared patience, trust, and attention to detail. Riverways and hidden paths, not all trade moves overland. Rivers such as the Rufiji, Ruvuma, and Zambezi provide alternative routes, carrying goods in canoes, rafts, and small boats. Here, navigation requires skill. Knowledge of currents, sandbars, and seasonal water levels is essential. These water routes offer speed compared to the inland paths, but come with their own risks. Flooding can destroy cargo, crocodiles may attack, and shallow sandbanks can strand boats for days. Every river journey is a calculated risk, demanding constant vigilance and patience. Even the smallest errors, a misread current, a poorly tied bundle, can delay the entire supply chain. Merchants know that the ocean, the forest, and the river are partners in commerce, each with their own demands that must be met carefully, quietly, and consistently. The rhythm of arrival when caravans finally reach the Swahili harbors. The city's rhythm absorbs them without haste or fanfare. Goods are unloaded slowly, inspected meticulously, and integrated into the marketplace. Ivory is counted and stacked. Spices are weighed and displayed. Gold dust is transferred into secure containers. Coastal merchants maintain careful records, often cross-referencing with inland traders' ledgers to ensure consistency. The arrival of goods is celebrated quietly, with acknowledgement of the labor, risk, and endurance required to bring them safely. The success of trade depends not only on the physical journey, but also on the continuity of knowledge and careful attention at every stage. Coastal prosperity is inseparable from inland diligence, creating a web of dependence that stretches for hundreds of miles. Evening preparations as the sun sets over the coast. Dhows are moored, goods are secured, and families settle into their homes. Traders review ledgers, plan routes for upcoming caravans, and coordinate with guides inland. The quiet diligence that sustains the city continues unabated. Like the slow pulse of tides against coral walls, children play near the harbor. Camels kneel in shaded pens, and merchants walk the streets softly, aware that even small errors in judgment could affect distant partners in this calm. One observes the delicate balance of human endurance, natural forces, and social trust. The Swahili Coast thrives not because of spectacle, but because of careful attention, patience, and respect for the rhythms of wind, tide, and terrain. And yet, even in this quiet, one question lingers in the mind. How long can these intricate networks of trust, endurance, and observation endure before human ambition or environmental change tips the balance? The Swahili Coast, once vibrant with dhows, trade, and scholarly discourse, gradually found its rhythm disrupted. Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and other city-states had long flourished by balancing commerce, ocean currents, and inland connections. Their success depended on precise knowledge, quiet observation, and careful attention to detail. Yet the tides of history eventually reached them, slowly, imperceptibly, and with inexorable patience. By the 17th century, the Indian Ocean trade began to shift. European powers, having established fortified ports along the eastern coast, redirected routes. Portuguese, Omani, and later British influence disrupted long-standing Swahili networks. Ships arriving from Europe carried not only goods, but also political ambitions, treaties, and technologies that threatened to replace centuries of delicate, trust-based commerce with force and formal authority. Kilwa and the Portuguese incursion, Kilwa Kisiwani, once the shining jewel of Swahili trade, experienced the first major disruption. Portuguese fleets arrived in the early 16th century, armed with cannons and muskets. The coral walls that had quietly stood for centuries could not withstand such technology, and the city's rulers were forced to negotiate, submit, or flee. Yet Kilwa's decline was gradual rather than violent. Trade continued, though under new oversight. The dhows still carried ivory, gold, and spices, but patronage shifted. Coastal merchants had to navigate a new political reality, balancing loyalty to old trade networks with the pressures imposed by foreign powers. Even as the city adapted, the quiet equilibrium that had sustained Kilwa's prosperity, its reliance on careful observation, trust, and incremental negotiation was disrupted. Mombasa and Zanzibar, resilience under pressure. Mombasa, with its natural harbor, became a contested site. Portuguese, Omani, Arabs, and later European traders jostled for control. The city remained lively, but commerce now carried the weight of uncertainty. Merchants measured risk as carefully as they measured ivory or gold dust, and decisions were dictated not only by wind and tide, but by political expediency and survival. Zanzibar, too, grew under Omani influence, becoming a center for clove plantations and long-distance trade. Yet this prosperity came at the cost of autonomy. The slow, patient networks that had connected inland and coastal traders for centuries were increasingly subordinated to monopoly systems and foreign oversight. The rhythm of trade became less organic, more hierarchical. The coral walls and narrow streets remained, but their role had shifted. They were no longer solely vessels for human endurance and trust, but markers of a bygone era, a testament to what had once been sustained quietly over centuries. The inland connection weakens as European ships and foreign powers took precedence in long-distance trade. Inland networks weakened. Caravans slowed, redirected, or ceased entirely. Goods that had once moved predictably from the forests, savannas, and river valleys into Swahili ports were now absorbed by alternative markets. This disruption had subtle consequences. Traders had to renegotiate relationships, invent new routes, or abandon business entirely. The intricate system of trust and patience, the invisible web binding harbors to hinterlands, frayed slowly. Swahili commerce survived, but no longer in the quiet, steady cadence that had defined it for centuries. Cultural continuity amid declined. Despite these pressures, Swahili culture endured. Mosques, choral houses, and markets continued to exist. The dhows still sailed, and families maintained daily routines. Language, customs, and religious practices preserved identity even as trade networks shifted. Knowledge persisted quietly, passed from generation to generation. Stories of past trade agreements, the precise handling of ivory, spices, and gold dust, and the wisdom of observing tides and winds remained alive in oral traditions. The city's decline was not sudden. It was a gradual adaptation, a testament to human resilience in the face of environmental and political change. The passage of time, the decline of the Swahili harbors, reminds us that time is a quiet arbiter. Coral walls, meticulously carved and patiently built, cannot resist centuries of wind, rain, and waves. Trade networks, perfected over generations, can be redirected by foreign ambition or environmental change. Cities that once flourished on observation, patience, and trust must adapt or fade into memory. Yet, even in decline, these cities leave a legacy. The rhythm of life, the methods of trade, the delicate balance with nature, these endure as lessons for future generations. For anyone walking along the coral streets today, the echoes of dhows, the soft clatter of scales, and the careful measurement of goods can still be felt in the quiet cadence of history. A reminder of a civilization that thrived through observation, patience, and enduring respect for both the sea and the human networks it connected. Reflection. The story of the Swahili Coast is one of resilience and quiet adaptation. Its cities endured centuries of trade, political change, and environmental pressures because their inhabitants understood the importance of trust, patience, and subtlety. And yet, one cannot help but reflect. Even the most carefully maintained systems, whether coral walls, trade networks, or human relationships, are subject to the slow passage of time. A reminder that endurance often requires both humility and foresight.